First of all, it's been discussed many, many times that the total amount of income that an individual makes or has, and again, this could be income from work or it could be money that they inherited, does not seem to directly relate to their level of happiness. But I do want to earmark that finding because I agree that while money or total resources itself does not predict happiness in any kind of direct way, that is not the same thing as saying having very few resources will make you happier, of course. I don't think anyone would imagine that. Now, that said, I venture the argument that while money truly cannot buy happiness, it absolutely can buffer stress. And in particular, it can buffer stress in the form of the ability to purchase or pay for goods and services, and in particular services. You got to make ends meet, and at the same time, doing things for money. If you approach life that way, you're going to be miserable, and you're probably also never going to have enough. If you do things because you love them and you do them in a principled way, I've never seen it fail. I've never seen it fail. And I've punched the clock before too. I've done that too. Delivering bagels, bussing tables, all sorts of things. And it wasn't always easy. I mean, there were nights when I'm doing experiments and experiments are failing and stuff, but you just have to be grateful for the opportunity and then just suck it up and just get right back out there. I mean, reps. I mean, it works. It's always worked and it's always going to work. This idea of the introject is fascinating to me because what it says is that if you consume enough of that content, if you read enough books about people who have embarked on certain kinds of journeys and made certain choices, that at some point you might introject some of their personality and their responses and subconsciously start making decisions, hopefully positive decisions, on your own behalf, maybe having more appropriate boundaries, maybe taking better self-care or care of other people. And then at some point, you move from the introject to a recognition that, wait, it was me that made that change. I'm the one that managed to get up a bit earlier and do a little bit more, or to be kinder in this context, or to listen a little bit better in this context. The information that we consume sets the internal context of our subconscious and sets the internal context for what we decide to do consciously. And in many ways, it's sort of like garbage in, garbage out. And if it's, positive stories and inspiration that's how you're basically going to react in the world. When I moved from being a graduate student to a postdoc, for instance, my income went up slightly, went up by about 30 to 40%. But because of where I moved and because of the times, my cost of living went way, way up, and I was extremely stressed. So it wasn't my absolute income. It was my absolute income relative to my cost of living. The other thing that one needs to consider when considering income versus cost of living is there's also this notion of peer group, and we're going to talk more about social bonds and connections later. But one thing that I noticed when I moved from being a graduate student to a postdoc was I was a graduate student in a small town where I had access, if I chose, to participate in most, if not all, of the social gatherings because they were all very low cost. People tended to aggregate at the farmer's market on Saturday, but it was relatively low cost of living, and social connections and peer group interactions were all generated around the same fairly low cost activities. When I transitioned to being a postdoc, I made more money, but cost of living went up. But in addition to that, my peer group tended to want to engage in the same kinds of activities that people in that larger city were engaged in. So peer group has a tremendously powerful influence on whether or not we gauge the amount of money that we have as bringing us happiness or not. And that really speaks to the critical importance of social interactions and certain kinds of social interactions in particular. Now, if any of that was unclear, what I'm basically saying is it's not just about being able to pay your rent. It's also about being able to access the kinds of social interactions that you deem are, quote unquote, correct for you at that stage of life and in the place where you happen to be living. Because if you can meet all the demands of costs of rent and paying your power bill and food, et cetera, but you are socially isolated because your peer group or those around you that you want to engage with are engaging in activities that you either don't have time for, literally, because you're doing other things, or that you don't have the financial resources for, then that can actually severely impact this rating of what we call happiness.